And our Soapbox Social panel is here. Of course, it is Thursday. And former BC Premier John Horgan's posthumous memoir, In His Own Words, co-written by Rod Mickleborough, continues to inspire articles and discussion. From his chapter On the Job, Horgan says, "Over the course of my first government with Carol James as finance minister, we chalked by some massive surpluses that allowed us to pay down the provincial debt as well. They weren't because of budget cuts, but because of economic growth and strategic tax increases. Some have noted that when Horgan stepped down, he left the province with a debt of $89 billion. And over David Eby's first 2 years of premier, that rose about half to $133 billion. Joining us now in studio with their thoughts on that and more, of course, is our Soapbox Social panel. Kyla Lee is a Vancouver criminal lawyer for Acumen Law Corporation. Good afternoon, Kyla.
Hello.
And Amir is the host of the podcast, This is Van Color. Hello.
Hello.
Mo, let's start with you.
Sure.
How do you make, or what do you make, I should say, of how quickly BC's debt has grown under David Eby since John Horgan?
So first of all, I do want to establish that I am a stan for Carol James. I think she was a fantastic finance minister. However, I think it's important to also put everything into context and recognize that under John Horgan, his government benefited from a very hot real estate market, which meant a lot of revenue from the property transfer tax, foreign buyers tax. They also were collecting the carbon tax revenue as well, which now we've done away with. And we did have a faster than expected economic recovery from 2020. So you have to think, around John Horgan's time, the unemployment rate was around 4% in BC. Currently, it's closer to 6%, but still below the national average. So, his government, while somewhat disciplined, did also benefit from a good time. And I think one of the best examples is the 2021 deficit that they had projected to be about $10 billion, but then ended up being only about $500 million in the end. Is Premier Eby spending too much? I would say probably, yeah. There needs to be a little more discipline and they need to rein things in. But at the same time, let's not, completely say that the Horgan government didn't benefit from a good economic environment.
Fair. And Kyla, the BC NDP held off the Conservatives in the last election, but does Eby sort of have to shake that reputation for, as the Sun calls, wrecking Horgan's legacy and hurting the NDP's prospects for political success in the future?
I mean, the common sense part of me says no, and that most people will recognize that we're in the weirdest time ever. And you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said that. But, now with the huge amount of economics uncertainty we have because of the situation with Trump and the tariffs and all of that, people are just holding back. They're holding back on all of the things they otherwise would have spent money on that would have generated tax revenue for the province. So, I think the people who have enough common sense to recognize that probably aren't going to be so fussed about the fact that the debt has grown. It has to in a time like this. It's going to fix itself down the road. I'm not saying budgets balance themselves.
I was going to jump in there.
I was too. I'm like, how does that work?
The tides will turn. Trump won't be in office forever, and things will adjust back to normal spending.
Things wax and wane.
But I think in isolation, Kyla is correct that perhaps where the debt is doesn't weigh on most British Columbians. But I think in terms of the delivery of services, whether it is healthcare or education, or just, economic growth in general as well, that is more important to British Columbians than what the actual debt figure is.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Mo, tomorrow at 2 p.m., the BCGEU, which is, of course, one of BC's biggest unions, is set to announce the results of their strike vote after negotiations with the BC government's public service agency. And those broke down in July last month. So how significant do you think this labor dispute could become?
I think it's extremely significant, but not... It's significant in the sense that it sets the tone for other negotiations that we're going to have in this province. 450,000 BC public sector workers are at the negotiating table this year, 34,000 of which are the BCGEU workers. Public sector compensation in this province accounts for about 60% of the entire budget in British Columbia as well. So when we're talking about the debt, this is where a lot of those expenses come from. So how the BCGEU is able to negotiate their wage increases and other benefits will become a bit of an indication for how perhaps the BCTF, the Teachers Federation, or the BC Nurses Union will approach their negotiations. And I would actually say that the teachers and certainly the nurses will have a lot more public sympathy in terms of their demands than the BCGEU. So if the BCGEU gets a big increase, I would expect the nurses to go even harder in terms of what they can get because they know that the public does sympathize and support them.
Do you think the level of debt a government carries does affect contract negotiations, though?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a big factor. But I think that they're also looking at this $4 billion contingency fund that the government has set aside. We know that half of that is going to be eaten up by the loss of carbon tax revenue, but there's still $2 billion to play with that they're going to point at and say, well, this is what that contingency fund's for.
All right. Kyla, the NDP, it's always sort of traditionally been very pro-union. But as we said, the BCTF, the BCNU, and the PEA all have contracts that will expire this year. Do you think the BCGEU will set the tone for everyone?
I think it will set the tone for everyone. I think as well, when we think about historically the NDP being pro-union, I think the version of the NDP that we have right now doesn't look anything like what we've seen as a historical NDP. I think they're a lot more close to the center than they are to the left. And I think that's also going to impact the negotiations. They're going to be a lot more conservative because they've had to lean a lot more conservative to maintain power and to really satisfy the public cries for the things that people have been complaining about, like crime and situations that I don't necessarily agree exist, but
it's on their minds, though.
Exactly.
I do want to move on to another topic, so I'll start with you now, Kyla. Vancouver's new integrity commissioner says the mayor and his ABC party broke the code of conduct by planning and conducting amendments to motions in private group conversations before public council meetings. But the mayor issued a statement and says caucusing is a normal and accepted practice at every level of Canadian democracy. That is how thoughtful and effective decisions are made. It is not misconduct. Apart from people like us, perhaps, that sort of live and breathe City Hall news, how much do you think people really care about this issue?
I think people don't care about it in the nitty-gritty, but I do think that they care when they hear that the municipal government is violating ethics rules. I think that resonates with people, especially because there's been so much frustration for all sorts of reasons, pools and services and issues with the street sweeps that have plagued this government municipally. And so anything like a scandal like this, especially with the previous history of trying to silence the ethics commissioner, all of this stuff supports that it's likely the public is going to be bothered by this, even if they don't actually care why it is there was a rule broken.
Okay. And Mo, Kenneth Chan, I don't know if you read it, Daily Hive's urbanized editor, wrote a very passionate and quite rare opinion piece calling Vancouver's policy a double standard. And he sort of points out that people were critical of the former Mayor Kennedy Stewart for not being able to make any changes, and now they're critical of Ken Sim for organizing votes. So would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. Here's the thing. Different levels of government operate differently. And so I don't think it's fair to say, oh, well, the province gets to caucus and, they have a whip and all that stuff. Like, you just can't compare the two. Pete Fry noted, and someone should fact check him on this, but he said, the rule that was broken is a 140-year-old rule. So there's longstanding precedents. Even in the Integrity Commissioner's report, there are emails that suggest that a couple of members of that caucus, kind of soft flagged it in terms of like, oh, are we breaching any rules here by discussing this? So I don't buy this argument that like, oh, well, other levels of government do it. Now, in this idea of like, okay, well, Kennedy Stewart struggled with this. Kennedy Stewart was an independent mayor, didn't have a party to begin with, with very fractured caucus compared to what we have now. And I think at the end of the day, if ABC Vancouver is able to point to accomplishments, they would have a much more forgiving public. And that's going back to what Kyla was saying as well, is that, I think this accumulative effect of these like sort of smaller scandals, they just add up, and they add up in particular weight when Ken Sim and ABC Vancouver can't really point to any big accomplishments of what they've done. If everyone was happy with this government, this is a nothing burger. But it's the added effect of stuff like this. And thank you.
That is our Soapbox Social panel. Mo Amir, the host of This Is Van Color podcast, and Kyla Lee, a criminal lawyer for Acumen Law Corporation.